Thank you for taking the time to watch this brief video on color layering and color relationalism. The final version can be found in this issue of Minds and Machines. There are two broad motives for the talk. One is a general interest in color layering, and another is an interest in ontological disputes within the theory of color. The outline is pretty simple, and the main idea is that justification for relationalism usually involves an inference of this sort, from the contextual dependency of experienced color on an extrinsic factor to the constitutive dependency of color on that factor. And I think color layering gives us some reason to pause when making this inference. Color layering as a broad idea requires very few pre-theoretic commitments. It requires the commitment to transparent colored things, perhaps also opaque colored things, and also the possibility of layering in ontology and experience. And we should make explicit at the outset that experiences of color layering entail a very peculiar kind of contextual interdependency of one color on another. Suppose we have a proximal transparent color layer and a distal opaque color layer. If you experience color layering, then your experience of the proximal layer occurs by looking through it to the distal opaque layer, and your experience of the opaque layer occurs by looking through the proximal layer to it. Hence, your experience of one is in an important way interdependent on your experience of the other. You might wish to understand layering by contrast with some other cases. So in experienced layering, we have two distinctly experienced colors along a line of sight. In fusion, we have two or more items contributing to experience along a line of sight, but those contributions are not distinctly experienced. They are instead mixed or fused together. And in neither, you have one color experienced along a line of sight, and that color is being contributed to by only one item. I put an asterisk around neither because I'm not sure how often it happens, and as we'll see, it turns out to be irrelevant to the logic of the argument of this paper. Construed most broadly, color relationalism asserts that color is not intrinsic to objects, but only persists by virtue of relations those objects bear to other objects. To flesh out a relationalism, one has to specify the class of objects that instantiate these relational colors, and there are several options available. And one also has to specify the class of relations that constitute colors. Several options here are possible too. A well-known source of evidence for color relationalism is simultaneous contrast effects, or what we'll call center-surround instances of the relativity of color. In these important phenomena, two samples that are materially identical are experienced to be quite different in color. Our best explanation as to why this experiential difference obtains is because each sample is surrounded by different colors and textures. Hence, you have some intuitive motive to infer that the color of a thing depends on what it's surrounded by. Turning that intuitive reasoning into an argument takes some work, but has been done. Here's one rendering of it. Premise 1, the relativity of color perception. In this case, the experienced color of some object A depends on experienced colors of objects that surround it. There's no principled or well-motivated reason for singling out a preferred surround for experiencing A's color. We're therefore obligated to weigh these different color experiences of A equally. We have no reason to think that A is intrinsically changing across these different surrounds. And hence, we have some explanatory import for the thesis of color relationalism. So we can infer not merely that A's experienced color depends on the experienced colors of objects surrounding it, but that A's color proper depends on the colors proper of objects surrounding it. And of course, what a relationalist like Jonathan Cohen wants is to generalize this reasoning to a number of different instances of the relativity of color. And doing that, of course, requires the hypothesis that they can all be treated uniformly. It is this generalization step that I wish to target through color layering. Section 3, Layering and Relationalism. For simplicity, let's split the relativity of color into three broad classes. Center-surround instances, examples of which we just saw. Line-of-sight instances, these are relevant to color layering and are our focus. And perceiver-object instances, which we will set aside. There are a surprisingly large number of phenomena that fall under the LOS class of relativities. And I believe that of those phenomena, the ones that involve experience color layering can be used to undermine the reasoning for explanatory import. Consider then a layering scenario. Suppose there is an opaque white object. The cube that you see is of course many-colored. I'll call it white for simplicity. And a transparent red object and a transparent green object. Suppose we're first presented with the white behind the red and then the white behind the green. Suppose, in addition, that in both contexts you experience color layering. That is, first you experience opaque white through transparent red, and then you experience opaque white through transparent green. My thought is that a layering scenario like this does not ground color relationalism. We experience an opaque white through a transparent red and then an opaque white through a transparent green. There is a contextual interdependency of your experience of one color on the other, but we would never infer from this that those colors are constitutively interdependent on one another. We would never infer color relationalism. Perhaps the easiest way to see that is to just suppose that in this layering scenario, these objects are intrinsically colored as opposed to relationally. We would still have a contextual interdependency of one's experience of one color on the other, but no evidence, and indeed it would be false to infer that the colors were constitutively interdependent on one another. Applying this to the reasoning employed earlier for color relationalism is instructive. Is this an instance of the relativity of color perception? I think a reasonable case can be made for the answer being yes. Can we endorse no privilege? That is, can we endorse the claim that we shouldn't privilege one of these perceptions over the other? Again, I think the answer is yes. We can therefore support 3 and treat both perceptions as epistemically the same. And we can also infer 4 that the objects are stable across these circumstances. What we don't have evidence for is explanatory import, that is, the explanatory value of postulating relationalism to explain this kind of phenomena. One of many questions you might have at this point concerns the relevance of fusion to the discussion. Do fusion experiences provide evidence for relationalism? My answer is, all else being equal, perhaps, but given layering available as a contrast, then no. To briefly see why, let's return to the main argument for relationalism. Both fusion and layering experiences are reasonable examples of the relativity of color perception, but what we can't endorse is no privilege. For in this case, what we should privilege crucially hinges on our interests. If what we want to know is the contribution of a surface color or the contribution of a filter to what we see, then we would privilege a layering experience over a fusion one. By contrast, if what we want to know is how multiple contributions are experienced when they're mixed or fused together, then we would privilege a fusion experience over a layering one. So in general, we can't endorse no privilege. Without that, ecumenicism also should be rejected. And although there are some interesting questions around object stability, we, to this point already, have enough evidence to not infer our conclusion. So, most generally, does the LOS class of relativities ground relationalism? Layering does not. Fusion on its own might, but given layering as a possible contrast, it does not. And the neither category is not needed to reach this conclusion. If it turns out that there are cases of neither, then they would provide further means of eroding the justification for relationalism. In conclusion, the explanatory import of relationalism hinges on an inference of this sort, from the contextual dependency of experienced color on an extrinsic factor to the constitutive dependency of color on that factor. This inference is sometimes plausible, but it fails for layering. These two conclusions result from denying the uniformity hypothesis. The relativities of color, rather than yielding identical considerations that put pressure on us to favor a uniform reaction in each case, yield differing considerations, some of which pressure us to become relationalists, others of which do not. The global pressure towards relationalism is illusory. Thank you.